Good afternoon. My name is David Luberoff, and I am the Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I am thrilled to welcome you to today's research seminar on the impact of Airbnb on the residential housing market before COVID-19, estimates from New York City. This reports on work that Sophie Calder-Wang did while she was a Meyer Fellow, again, before the COVID pandemic, but I think is still really timely. Before we begin, I have one announcement and just a couple of logistical details. Next Thursday at 4 o'clock, the last event of our fall series will be the release of the 2020 State of the Nation's Housing Report. Usually comes out in June, but we delayed it this year so that we could get some data on how the pandemic was influencing housing issues, and then of course other events, including record numbers of natural disasters and protests highlighting racial injustice have highlighted some other key issues. That will be on Thursday at 4 o'clock. We'll start with a presentation of the report's findings by Dan McHugh, who led the effort to produce the report. And then we'll have a panel discussion with Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, David Brickman, the CEO of Freddie Mac, Marietta Rodriguez, the president and CEO of NeighborWorks America, and Chris Herbert, the Joint Center's managing director. Nicole Friedman, who covers real estate for the Wall Street Journal, will be the moderator. Should be a terrific event, 4 o'clock on Thursday. Second, two quick logistical things. First, you can use Zoom's Q&A feature to pose some questions for today's speaker. We may pause about halfway through the presentation to see if there are any methodological questions. So if you're not quite sure about the data that you're seeing or the way Sophie is using it. And we will also be posting Sophie's slides on our website after this. We will try to get to as many of the questions as possible, but can't promise we'll get to all of them. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Sophie Calder-Wang. Sophie was a Joint Center Meyer Doctoral Fellow. She was actually slated to present this work last fall, but we then canceled it when the pandemic first hit. So we're really thrilled that we still have a chance to do that. Since last spring, Sophie has graduated, received her doctorate, and is now an assistant professor in real estate at Penn's Wharton School. Sophie will take about 30 minutes to present the work she did, and then we'll move to Q&A. We'll wrap things up just a bit after 1 o'clock. Sophie, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Glad to see everyone here, and also I wanted to especially thank the Joint Center for allowing me to become a Myers Fellow, and also provided great support both financially and intellectually to make this research possible. So without further ado, let me try to tackle the screen sharing. Okay. David, are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Um, okay. So this work is about understanding the impact of the sharing economy and especially Airbnb on the housing market. The focus is going to be on New York City, and I've used mostly data and methods in the pre-COVID period. And I hope this framework, regardless what happens after COVID shakes out, will remain useful as a framework and a guiding tool for us to think about how the housing market interacts with various components of the technological changes that are brought about by the sharing economy. So let's see. Okay. Just a little bit of a motivation. In fact, if you think about the recent rapid growth of the sharing economy that's facilitated by technology, much of it is concentrated in this idea that we have reduced transaction costs in many of our day to day lives. And by reducing transaction costs, it allows many of the previously underutilized assets to become much more widely accessible online. So, for example, our housing. Now, In this case, the services, such as housing services, especially short term housing services, are now produced by individuals, be it residents or their property owners or even renters at times, rather than historically speaking, very large firms such as hotels. As you know, given that many of you are in the housing space, a prominent example of the sharing economy in this space is Airbnb. And we know it has, accumulated year over year growth very rapidly since its founding for the entire last decade. And in some sense, it is larger than any single individual hotel group. And in many cases, it has also had substantial impact on the housing market because we use much of the residential housing assets to serve the short term rental needs. However, because of this interaction between, the long-term rental and the short-term rental market, inevitably it invites very active political as well as regulatory debates. Now, to give you some sense of the amount of tension that was happening in New York City, which is one of the largest Airbnb markets in the United States, on the one hand, you have the city looking to crack down on Airbnb amid an affordability problem in among its housing units. At the same time, these kind of crackdowns are often not straightforward in the legal process. And I think more recently, there's some agreement between the city and Airbnb to limit Airbnb use to the more, resident hosts. But we see this as a ongoing battle, not only in New York City, but also many other places in the world. So I'm an economist, and I'm not trying to say what the policymaker should do or say what the company should do, but the goal of this research is, can we at least put some parameters and put some quantifications about the impact of Airbnb in New York City via its housing market? So in particular, what I wanted to answer, and I hope this will be useful for those interested in its subsequent regulatory implication, is there a way that we can estimate both the aggregate welfare as well as the distributional impact of Airbnb on renters of New York City, which is the majority of its residents? And when I speak of welfare, there are two pieces of welfare that I want to get at. One is this notion of increased utilization, the utilization benefit, in that it allows residents to share part of their home with out of town visitors. Like I can share my living room with out of town visitors during periods of heightened demand. And this, in some sense, should benefit me because, I am producing some additional services based on where I live. And before Airbnb, this would be very difficult to do. However, I think much of the political debate stems from the fact that it also motivates, incentivizes landlords to completely reallocate housing away from long term rental to short term rental so that they are no longer available for rental at all for the residents. And this could be problematic in two ways. One is that, okay, you're kicking out your tenant right now, but more broadly, and I think this is an underappreciated, is more broadly when this unit becomes unavailable, it will have an equilibrium price impact for everyone else who is looking to rent because the price has gone up for renters. Now, I think this is a part where Airbnb is getting regulated away in the New York City context, but I'm using the data prior to the actual ban to give some parameters about what could it be the impact in some sense if we don't put on these types of regulation. And lastly, and I think this is really the strength of, as you will see later on why I'm putting some um, sort of equations and all that stuff into this framework, is that I really want to know not just, in aggregate how many units are, used for Airbnb and for how much price. But more importantly, I want to have a sense to connect it with the underlying characteristics of the city residents. So I want to understand how does the utilization benefit and how are the reallocation effects affect different households, say by their income, education, race, and family structure. Okay. Um, so this is probably a very familiar map for many of you. This is Airbnb in New York City. Um, so the roughly speaking, the depth of the color is my approximation of the fraction of the underlying housing market that has ever participated in Airbnb. Ever meaning I have some estimate that it had experienced a transaction on Airbnb. So you can see, like, across various neighborhoods of New York, some parts are really active and some parts, are not nearly as active. And in certain neighborhoods like Chelsea and Williamsburg, you see over 8% of the underlying housing units have experienced some Airbnb activity. However, insofar as we worry about those units that are being permanently removed because of Airbnb, and in my data, I try to look for those that are being made available on Airbnb for substantial periods of time, over 6 months or even over 12 months. That actually is a much smaller fraction. It's less than 1% of the underlying housing stock that seems to be, permanently removed from the long-term rental housing market. So I think this very simple counting exercise gives you a sense for both in terms of the activity of Airbnb back in 2018 in New York, as well as how it affects different housing segment differently. Okay. So I'm going to give you a preview of the approach and my result. The approach that I'm taking borrows from the economics literature where people have written down structural models of housing markets. And in this case, it's not just a singular residential housing market, but an integrated housing market where the long term traditional residential housing market gets integrated with a short term rental hospitality market. However, in this case, because we are dealing with housing, it is really heterogeneous. It's not the same everywhere. So I want to model this as a differentiated product by many attributes, such as location, but also hedonic attributes like number of bedrooms, so on and so forth. And lastly, to be able to connect this framework to distributional impact, what I want to do is I want to write a demand specification where I allow for heterogeneity in both housing demand and Airbnb supply based on people's different demographic characteristics. And this is something that the model gives me that, a simple counting exercise wouldn't be so easy to get at. So here is a preview of the finding, and I want you to think about it in sort of a critical light, not necessarily take it at the face value. So, what I'm finding is that the reallocation effect, as far as renters are concerned, the reallocation effect dominate the utilization effect for renters. What ends up happening is that there is a substantial rent loss in terms of transfer from renters to property owners when you count it in NPV terms. So if we assume Airbnb stays the way it was in 2018, it would amount to about $2.7 billion. Whereas the gain that accrue to hosts who are able to host visitors in their homes will only amount to about $300 million. However, the data and the model actually reveals that the increased rent burden disproportionately fall on higher income, more educated, and white renters, predominantly because the shape of the Airbnb market in New York City. And at the same time, the utilization gains there is a sense in which the utilization gains only help a small fraction of households because really at the end of the day only a small fraction of the residents participate in Airbnb as hosts, but they're the kind of hosts who really value the income that they can make from the platform. So I think this is actually quite nuanced finding. You can't just, conclude it is very bad, it is very good. It actually affects different demographic groups very differently. Okay, so uh, I want to. I'm going to skip the literature, but for those who are interested in it, intersects with the canonical housing policy literature, but also there is a nascent and growing literature on the sharing economy, where the paper contributes in terms of both a inform the policy debate, but also provide a way to understand the distributional implications. You might be interested in the data that I use. And I'd be actually curious if you have additional data that can supplement this. For now, what I'm using is coming from two sources. One is a estimate of Airbnb usage. There are a number of scraped version of Airbnb.com out there. I use one of them, and it's done by a third party. What it gives me is essentially what you see on Airbnb.com, where I have a measure, an approximation of the location in terms of latitude and longitude up to some privacy error that is added by Airbnb, but also the type of property, the number of bedrooms. On top of that, I have a rough estimate of the daily performance of each property in New York, in that it tries to estimate the price and quantity, so whether a room was booked at a given price on a given day. Now, combining this data with the more standard census data, so what I'm using is the American Community Survey microdata. In this case, I'm using their individual level housing choices. So I see the entire vector of demographic characteristics, such as income, education, race, age, household size, etc., as well as the housing unit that they're currently living in. And in this case, it includes not only the physical attributes, but also how much they are paying, as well as where it is in terms of the neighborhoods that you just saw on the map. What it has, even though it is not, at the address level, it does give me the data at the PUMA level, the public use micro area level. And because New York City is actually very dense, it divides the New York City into 55 pumas, and that's the neighborhood that I am analyzing at. Now, if there were, more detailed data for the census or for Airbnb usage, I could even get to finer geographic, specifications. Okay, so before I get to the model, are there any clarifying questions that I should address, David?
I have not seen any so far in the chat or in the
Good.
Q&A.
Good. Okay. So the model, I'm gonna show you a stylized model before I get to sort of the bells and whistles for the full model, and then I'll get to the estimation. So I'll start with the stylized model, and let me see if I can get you on board. The stylized model is sort of a Econ 101 model. And obviously, there are many, many approaches to analyze the housing market, but I think, it is instructive to borrow just from the basic demand and supply frameworks that economists have. So, what I have in mind is that before Airbnb were invented, there was a long-term rental market where residents look for a place to live in the city, and then there's a short-term rental market where tourists and visitors look for a place to stay for a short period of time. You can think of the left-hand side being, something that you'll look to rent for a year, and then on the right-hand side, something you'll look to stay anywhere between 1 to say 15 days. In practice, these are not completely segmented, but I think for simplification, you can think of, hotel rooms were just used for tourists and then apartments were just used for long-term residents. I think that's a fine assumption. With the advent of Airbnb, which you can think of it as a unanticipated technological shock, what it does is that it removes the barrier between these two markets. And if I were a property owner, and I own a unit in the long-term rental market. And if I saw I could obtain higher prices in the short-term rental market, what it will do is it will incentivize some of us to reallocate to the short-term rental market. And how many of us will move? Well, that we're gonna keep reallocating as long as you can't make more money by moving. So in this case, you'll say, okay, the total quantity that may be reallocated to Airbnb in the regulatory free framework will be pinned down by the equilibrium, the no arbitrage condition between these two markets. So as a property owner, I will stop moving to Airbnb if I don't think it will derive higher income for me. Now, even in this very simple framework, you can see that this is going to actually drive up the prices in the long-term rental market. And this big rectangle is going to be the transfer from renters to owners, whereas this small triangle will be the welfare loss for those who are essentially pushed out. Well, it's not necessarily pushed out in that, they themselves are the one where their landlords are using Airbnb. It's more like given the price increase, they're better off moving, say, to the suburbs. So, in other words, if there is a way for me to estimate the slope of this demand curve, and I can read off from data how many units are plausibly being reallocated to Airbnb, this gives me some ability to back out the size of this trapezoid, which is, the welfare implication from reallocation. However, like I said before, a key component of Airbnb is it allows the underlying asset to be used more efficiently without necessarily displacing anyone. So if I'm sharing my study or my home office with someone when prices are high, it doesn't necessarily displace me. So in order to capture this component of Airbnb, what I'm going to model this is I'm going to model this as a further shift out of the supply curve in the short-term rental market without necessarily having an impact of the total number of units available in the long-term rental market. So when this gets shifted out, you can restore the equilibrium between these two markets just like before. But now, if I am able to estimate the slope of this component, which is the supply of resident hosts, so people who can host Airbnb guests while they live in their home, then this triangle underneath the price and the supply curve is going to give me an estimate of the welfare gain that are accruing to the host. And this is important because this is in some sense the Airbnb technology allows us to produce more efficiently from the existing assets. So I want to be able to get at this as well. So in other words, you can think of the entire exercise as a full blown version of the stylized model, where the first step is I will estimate the long term rental demand here to capture the impact, the welfare impact of reallocation from this long term to short term rental market. And the second part of the exercise is to be able to estimate the slope of the supply curve so that I can capture the gain from this increased utilization. Okay, so um, usually people will ask, why do you then want to write down a full model that has tons of equations in it? And the answer is the following is, I do want to understand the impact of Airbnb by not giving up that housing market is a market. So equilibrium effects matter. If you take housing units away from one part of the neighborhood, it will transmit its price impact to other neighborhoods. So that's one. Number two is I want to get at slightly more realistic substitution pattern. So when a part of the housing market becomes affected, it's not going to affect the neighboring neighborhoods equally. It will depend on the characteristics of the neighborhoods and the characteristics of the housing stock in these neighborhoods. And number three, and I think most importantly, is if I can write down a demand model, I can estimate coefficients that allows me to project back to the household characteristics. So from housing characteristics to demographic characteristics. Now, in doing so, I have to preface that I make some pretty useful and helpful but strong, somewhat strong assumptions, and you want to interpret the results accordingly. One is that the supply of physical structures in New York City for long-term rental is fixed. I think this is a very reasonable assumption in the short run, but obviously it is not in the long run. So you can think of this estimate essentially as a short run approximation if we don't allow for more buildings, say in New York City. And as such, all the dynamic considerations are ignored. And lastly, which you might also argue, is I'm not fully capturing some of the externalities. So if you have a neighbor that's immediately next to you that introduced tons of tourists into your neighborhood, then you might, be a little annoyed, but this is not fully captured in the model. But on the other hand, if you have more tourists, it will also have spillover effects to the neighboring, amenities like restaurants and bars, and neither is this going to be captured. So that's the part that is also ignored. So in some sense, I'm focusing on the housing market, assuming the neighborhood characteristics are not materially changing, but just by what I can observe. Okay. For those who are interested in the equations, I'll give you a sense for how they are constructed and how they are estimated. So I'll start with the demand. So that gives me the ability to estimate the reallocation channel. So the demand is specified by this utility specification, where I'm looking at the utility of household I from renting a potential housing unit J of type H. So, what is the utility a function of? It's going to be a function of how expensive it is and a function of the characteristics that it has. And how valuable, how costly it is to you, and how valuable are these attributes are going to be captured by these coefficients, the price coefficients and the household specific preference coefficients. And these are all going to have subscript I in it because I'm going to allow this to be a function of demographic characteristics. Econometrically, I allow for some unobserved quality. So some neighborhoods are unobserved, like unobservably good or bad that I can't measure. I want to allow for that. So then I can integrate out the demand function because everyone who's going to choose this particular housing type is going to be everyone who thinks that this housing type is better than everything else out there. So that's all good. And this is quite useful because in the pre Airbnb world, this will already give me market clearing, which means demand equals to supply for each type. Whereas if you think some of the housing is reallocated, this will require the demand for each housing type for long term rental equals to the supply of the physical structures less what you see have migrated to Airbnb. And then for the supply side, it's actually quite similar. What I have is, well, first I have those that I observe that have permanently moved to from long term to short term. But more importantly, I want to capture the supply of short term rental by resident host. So if you're thinking about someone who's deciding whether to make my study available, say for graduation or for New Year's Eve, I'm going to say, okay, the utility I'm going to get is a function of how much money I can make out of this, but less the cost. It's not going to be free. And how much I value this income and how much it is costly is going to be a function of who I am. And I model this as similar as, a function of demographic characteristics. I also allow for some unobservable costs. But at the end of the day, the supply is going to be a integral of all those who are living in the neighborhood who can profitably supply at the prevailing price. That's going to be my supply function. Okay, so now from a theoretical point of view, I can specify market clearing, which is a vector of prices for all housing types and the vector of prices for Airbnbs, such that they clear both the long term rental market and the short term rental market. Okay, so this is essentially the framework. Now, I do have to go through a process to estimate the parameters, but I will be brief here because most of the estimation process are borrowed from the existing IO literature, the industrial organization literature, where they have done most of the heavy lifting for estimating these kind of demand models. So at the end of the day, because I have very detailed data on people's characteristics and housing characteristics, I can pin down the preferences for different households. And then similarly, I can pin down the price coefficients by looking at the shape of the underlying housing stock. Now, one feature of the housing market, as you may know, is there's very strong sorting. So, what you'll end up seeing is that households of a certain demographic characteristics, say race and ethnicity, have very strong sorting preferences, and this shows up in my estimate as you see here. Also, I find higher income and larger households tend to live outside of New York City. In terms of these, physical characteristics, you find fairly reasonable coefficients such as, larger households are going to care about larger homes more so than small households, so on and so forth. And lastly, I find that, essentially higher income households are less sensitive to rent. So I would say like this model does a reasonable job capturing key moments of the data. Um, so at the end of the day, when I put this together, what I find is that there is an aggregate price elasticity of about one. What that means is that, perhaps a 1% contraction in overall supply on average results in a 1% increase in price. So this is the demand side. And then I'll get to the supply side, and then we'll get to the results, which is a more fun part. The supply side, to estimate the supply side, because I don't have data internally from Airbnb, this is going to be an approximation. But this is, I think, a decent approximation because I actually see the same neighborhood over many, many days when prices shift. So, in other words, you can think of the following thought experiment. I have many different neighborhoods in New York City. Sometimes prices are high, sometimes prices are low because of, let's say, seasonality in demand. And when prices are high, I see more additional units coming online, let's say from the lower income neighborhoods. So that's how I back out. Perhaps it is the lower income households who are more supply elastic. They care about this additional income more so than those who are living in high income neighborhoods. And this is what I find in terms of the estimate. So, what I find is that, first of all, which is very interesting, is in terms of short-term supply on Airbnb from hosts, it's quite elastic. So with a small increase in price, you do see people try to participate. And it's especially elastic among those who are lower income. You see more of them who care about this. And on average, we see the lower cost suppliers are those who are educated, who have a college degree, but also those who are young and who have no children. So those are the demographic group that seems to have lower average cost. And this actually begs a little bit of a question on, who are the Airbnb hosts and what is the population that Airbnb is benefiting from the host side. Okay, now I'm going to get to the fun part, and I think this is the part where your thoughts are also going to be appreciated. So I'm trying to run these two counterfactuals. One is, what if I shut down? What if, I guess not me, but the city regulator shut down this reallocation, which is a direction that New York City is going towards? And the second is, what is the gain from the utilization effect? So what I do is I compare two worlds where I allow people to share their homes where they live versus where they're not allowed to. And then I can maybe tally them up together. So this is an overview. So on the left hand on here, this is a distribution where I estimate in terms of the loss from the rent channel. So for renters, how much higher rent they are paying because a small fraction of the housing is being reallocated. Whereas the right-hand side here, the green part is the gain from the host channel. So what you'll see is that it's heavily, centered around zero because at the end of the day, most people are not Airbnb hosts. But for the few who are, they do benefit a lot. So if you put them together, what you'll find is that, for the median renter, it doesn't really matter. They're going to be hit by the increasing rent. And in fact, that's the case for 98% of the renters, but for a small fraction of renters, they do benefit. So, okay. So, how do I actually come up with the numbers? Eh, Conceptually, it's very simple. Remember, I said about the market clearing in the long term rental market? All I'm doing is I'm computing a new price vector where this price vector is going to be the demand for each housing type to equal to the total supply of physical units because I'm going to put all of those that have been reallocated to Airbnb back onto the long-term rental. And if you assume that the error is logit, which is the trick that IO economist loves, it gives you a closed form solution. And not only it gives me a closed form solution, in aggregate, it gives me this compensating variation, which is essentially a measure of the welfare for all renters, for every individual. So this has a subscript I in it. Now, because I have this welfare measure for all of them, I can cut them by, different demographic characteristics that I would like to look into. So for example, by household size, what you see is that, it actually hits smaller households more so than larger households. And this is perhaps not terribly surprising because in all sorts of estimates, you find that it's a smaller unit, at least in terms of the urban markets in New York City, that are more commonly seen on Airbnb. So the effect is more concentrated on the smaller households. And you might also wonder the relationship across race and ethnicity. Among the renters, I actually find it's a slightly larger hit among white and Asian renters as opposed to Black and Hispanic renters. Now, this is in part because of just the shape of where Airbnbs are. So, this is on the left hand side, the percentage of Airbnb reallocation. And then on the right hand side, this is demographics by the percentage of the household head who are white. And this is for African American, this is for Hispanic, and then this is for those with college degrees. So this map perhaps gives you a sense that it's not terribly surprising that the rent channel also hits those college educated households more. However, if you also cut this by, income quintiles, you'll similarly find that it hits the higher income households more. Now, I just want to say this is actually both interesting and not to be extrapolated because it in large part is driven by the geography of Airbnb reallocation in New York City. In the context of New York City, there are just many more Airbnbs in higher income, more educated, and white neighborhoods. Secondarily, it is a little bit skewed by the way economists measure welfare in terms of willingness to pay, because higher income households just have higher willingness to pay for all housing attributes. So if their housing becomes reallocated to Airbnb, it will, sort of mechanically result in them having being hit harder. And then lastly, which is I think is interesting feature of housing, which is because we all like to live in neighborhoods that in some sense demographically similar to us. When we are hit, when we need to move, we are going to move to other neighborhoods that look like us. So in this particular case, if it's a higher income neighborhood that see more reallocation, these households are going to move to other higher income neighborhoods and further exacerbate the price impact within their own demographic characteristics. And you can easily imagine in an alternative scenario, if Airbnb hit in a different demographic area, this is also going to exacerbate the impact within their own demographics. Just because we like to stay with those who are like us, we also spread the impact closer to those who are like us. So this is an interesting feature of the housing market. Now, in terms of the utilization effect, the host channel, um, I think you'll find this distribution interesting. So basically, this is saying the ability to host Airbnb guests is not very worthy for most people. I mean, most people are not hosts. And even for the 90th percentile, it's not terribly worthwhile on a per annum basis. But for those who are really on the right tail, who have low cost to host visitors and travelers, they value it quite a bit, at over $300 per annum. And then for some of the lower income folks, they could really value it. Like here, my estimate is that for those who are in the lowest income quintile, they benefit by over $400. So, as you can see, like the impact of Airbnb and its distributional implication is really quite nuanced if you want to, slice it carefully. Now, if you say, okay, what is the aggregate impact? You're still going to see the aggregate impact is much larger when you have equilibrium impact on all renters, which amounts to about $2.7 billion. And the utilization benefit are only going to benefit those who actually participate. So that's why it's only $300 million. Usually at this point, people will say, why do you only care about renters? We are at a housing talk, but we don't only just care about renters. We should have some care and value for those who are property owners as well as visitors and hotels. So I provide some back of envelope calculation where, you say the increased renters is just transferred to the owners, and the owners themselves can be hosts as well. And then on top of that, there's going to be net gains accrue to tourists, less the loss by the hotels. So overall, this technology, Airbnb being able to reduce transaction costs should be welfare enhancing for society. However, it just doesn't get distributed equally. And in particular, if you are the city planner and if you only care about your median resident, it's going to be a problem because the median resident is going to be a renter and they're going to sit in this part of the waterfall chart, and then it's likely to be negative. But you have to sort of think about both the distributional impact as well as an aggregate impact and think about how to really balance these two. um, I do have to say, I'm making some assumptions here that I'm working towards. One is I'm not modeling this in the dynamic sense, in that I'm sort of making a static assumption where people can move fairly frictionlessly. But if you have very large switching costs, this is going to be, exacerbated actually. Um, so I'm running low on time, so let me conclude here. So what I hope to convey in this study is that by building a structural model of an integrated housing market, I find that, there is going to be welfare loss suffered by renters because of Airbnb. However, by modeling this carefully, I can also see this larger loss is actually suffered more towards the higher income, educated, and white renters, whereas the host gains accrue to a concentrated few, especially uh, younger, lower income, and educated households. So, what this leaves us with policy implication is actually not that obvious. The popular solution is obviously to restrict Airbnb reallocation. So, this will completely reverse the transfer from property owners back to renters. However, this is also going to remove a large part of aggregate welfare gain because now you can have visitors come to visit New York more cheaply, and then there will also be secondary beneficial impact to the city. So I think, because of the shape of the distributional impact and the fact that the median resident is a renter, we care about them, but we also realize if we completely kill Airbnb, this is going to be welfare reducing on the aggregate level. So so taking a step back, perhaps, and I think this is something perhaps the audience is sympathetic towards. The fundamental reason I'm finding the results I am finding when combining all different sources of data is that this rent increase is really driven by the fact that housing supply is very inelastic in these places. And you can imagine in an alternative world where housing can be freely added, we would have much less of a problem when it comes to the rent increase. So, at a broader level, I know this is difficult to come by, but at a broader level, because we have inelastic housing supply, this kind of necessitates that we are not able to take advantage of the technological gains as introduced by Airbnb as possible. So this is perhaps an incidence where how the pie is cut affects the political economy of the subsequent size of the pie. But I think one lesson I take, and I hope many of you also take from this, is that it's an interaction of the regulatory framework and the inelastic housing supply is sort of hand in hand with the problem that we face when Airbnb becomes a alternative option for how we use the housing assets. So, with that, I'm going to conclude and welcome all questions and suggestions and also follow ups. Thank you.
So Sophie, thank you. This is a really wonderfully nuanced set of findings that are really provocative. There are a couple of questions that some of which are clarifying. Um,
Mm.
one is the New York example completely unique, or would you expect to find something similar both in other cities, but also what would this sort of framework look like in rural areas? Presumably rural areas that are also popular tourist attractions.
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. I think to orient this research in the broader housing market, you can think of Airbnb operating in urban markets and operating in vacation markets. I don't think this research can tell us a great deal about the vacation markets. So it's more focused on urban markets. And I think when it comes to urban markets, I think this framework is more readily extendable to other cities. It's just that, maybe for New York or San Francisco or even LA, Boston, the shape of the supply curve for Airbnb is more vertical, whereas in other cities the shape of the supply curve may be a little bit more elastic. And then if you have the ability to put some parameters on the housing supply elasticity, this framework can be ported to other cities. So that would be how I think about the applicability of this framework, because at the end of the day it's trying to get at the tension between long-term residents and short-term residents, which applies more naturally to urban markets as opposed to vacation markets.
Um, Interesting question about is there any way, and do you in the data distinguish between people who are renting the extra bedroom versus kind of the whole unit phenomenon where the host is either moving out or the unit has actually been taken off of the long-term rental market? And what do you find when you think about that?
Yeah, so um, so there are essentially, I would say, two big groups. One is the group where the property owner has made the entire unit unavailable to long-term resident and only available on short-term rental market. That's what I try to approximate by examining the data to see, oh, it is on Airbnb all the time and see transactions on it fairly regularly. I'm going to assume they're gone from the long-term rental market. And then you have the other side of the spectrum where I only see, let's say, a single room being rented. And if you look at, the profile, it is fairly clear that the resident is on the premise. So I try to capture in my analysis. In practice, there is a bit of a gray area in the middle where you see some units that are on Airbnb, say like for a week or maybe for a month or so. Like, is that really one versus another? It's actually not obvious for me to tell. So for now, I have actually omitted that group. It's, I would say, about 10 to 15% of the transactions. So that um, I can't pinpoint. That's sort of the assumption that I have to make. But I do capture sort of the both extremes.
Just to follow that, if that's
Yeah.
10 to 15%,
Yeah.
what's the share that's kind of whole units, lots of time versus the extra room?
Yeah. So there are various assumptions that you can cut, but it's a little bit different when you count by properties and when you count by reservations. So, my estimate is if you count by properties, less than half of the properties belong to the first part, like the permanently, actually, way fewer than half of it. But in terms of reservations, because they're on Airbnb all the time, the vast majority, like way more than half of the reservations, goes to that group. And that's why it's a bit tricky because on the one hand, that's the part that's driving up the prices, but on the other hand, that's the part that's benefiting the visitors. So if you kill that part entirely, you're killing aggregate welfare, but you are helping, renters who would otherwise want to rent that, and also the equilibrium price impact of removing that unit to everyone else around that neighborhood, and so on and so forth.
Thanks. I think you touched on this, but a couple of you wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
If you think about neighborhoods that are gentrifying,
Yes.
um, and the extent to which um, Airbnb may be contributing to displacement, does your analysis allow you to pull those places out, and what do you think you might be seeing there?
So I think this is consistent with some other research as well, is that there is a trend in which you see more Airbnbs in gentrifying neighborhood. Um, is the gentrification caused by Airbnb? I don't think I have any evidence in support of that. Is Airbnb, happening concurrently as gentrification? I think that's likely to be true. How much does Airbnb exacerbate the existing gentrification? I think that's an interesting question to follow up. Right now, I only look at sort of a static version, so I can't really. Yeah, that's the part. Like, I'm assuming the gentrifying neighborhood just have the characteristics that it has. But if you think they're dynamic feedbacks, that's going to be a longer term study that I think would be more relevant if Airbnb is a large share of the underlying housing stock. So I would say New York would be one example, but I think honestly, many of the European cities could be a much bigger result of changing neighborhood. If you think of gentrification as changing neighborhood characteristics, when Airbnb is a much larger share of the underlying housing stock, that will start the process of changing neighborhood characteristics. Right now, it seems that it has a price impact, but not necessarily turning over the neighborhood characteristics. So that is a good question, and that this paper actually doesn't address on explicitly.
There's a clarifying question, just trying to make sure uh, what is the $2.7 billion loss? This is due to people paying higher rents because of the increased demand created by Airbnb.
Yeah, so you can think of this 2.7 billion. This is an MPV, so this is like aggregated over time. On the annual basis, it's like a tenth of it, about, $300 million. But in any case, this is caused by the fact that in an unregulated world, Airbnb will incentivize properties to shift from short-term to long-term rental, and therefore everyone is paying a little bit more. That is the interpretation of it. Now, this is assuming the housing stock doesn't get built in response to the increasing price, which I think is reasonable in the short run, but it's not reasonable in the long run. But whether it's reasonable in the long run or not depends on the regulation we're going to put forth. Yeah.
And particularly because new construction in the kinds of high demand neighborhoods is
Yeah, yeah. So the interpretation, like in order to reverse that, you can think of one way to reverse that is to shut down Airbnb. Another way to reverse that is to allow for more constructions, which is much harder, but in some sense is more welfare enhancing.
just to clarify, I think what you put up was that it's about $125 annual increase cost for the median renter.
Yeah, something like that.
One sort of final question. I don't know whether you're going to continue this research in on Airbnb. I know that your broader agenda has been about technological impacts in a variety of industries, but if you're going to continue, I'm just wondering where you're taking this, or if somebody were to pick up this research, what would you advise them to be kind of the next thing to look at?
Ah, um, I think there are broadly two components. I think there is this question about how we can use space more efficiently, Airbnb being an example, but you can actually think maybe Uber allows us to use our space more efficiently because it reduces the cost for us to go from one place to another. So it kind of changes the shape of our urban landscape. So that's very broad, but I do think how going forward space can be used efficiently, and also in the post-COVID world, how the space can be used efficiently when office and home assets are become more commingled. What is that going to look like? So that would be one thing that I personally would love to understand. And in terms of Airbnb itself, not related to housing, there is a sense that if we are back to the world where we can travel again, there is some, like one part that I said is that if you kill Airbnb, you're going to kill some tourists. But if other cities kill Airbnb, then New Yorkers can't cheaply go visit those places. So there's some sort of flow geographically about which tourists are net benefiters and which tourists are sort of imposing a cost on the residents. So, in some sense, there's some network of how people live and how people flow. And in some sense, in the correct regulatory framework, New York City regulators should also take into account the benefit of Airbnb when their residents go visit other places. And then, can that be somehow used to mitigate the equilibrium cost that's shouldered by the residents who are not using Airbnb? Now, this is a bit of a, how should I? This is a bit of a fantastic world that economists think, but I do think there is a trade sort of framework where people travel, and then how could we use that to still allow for cheaper travel without this kind of warped distributional implications. Now, in the actual trade world, that remains to be a problem, so I don't anticipate this to be solved here, but this gives us another lens for how flow of travelers cause a subsequent distributional impact that we otherwise don't have.
And it's an interesting place, I think, to end. And we have hit our end time, because I mean your estimates are, I think, really fascinating, and also because they identify not only kind of the aggregate impacts, but where they fall. And as I think you suggested, that creates a kind of political economy, starting with the fact that places like New York are so, have so many renters. Um, this question that of how other renters in the neighborhood or other residents may or may not feel about Airbnb in the ways it cuts. I think it's just a really rich and wonderful insight. This is exactly the kind of work that we hope to support, and we do support through the Meyer Fellowship. I'm thrilled that we have finally been able to get this, have you make this presentation. I'll let folks know, as Sophie mentioned, she's making some revisions, or she may not have mentioned, this may have been in an earlier conversation. She's revising some of her findings in part based on this discussion, and we will be releasing a working paper that summarizes this work, hopefully relatively soon. Keep your eyes open for that. And of course, as I said at the beginning, if you're interested in housing issues, which presumably you are since you're with us right now, be sure to tune in next Thursday at 4 o'clock for the release of the State of the Nation's Housing Report. And we can't, you can't hear us, but please do join me in thanking Sophie for a really interesting and fascinating presentation on an issue that may have waned temporarily, but is surely going to be back with us at some point. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Thank you for having me.